Good afternoon, migrant leaders, mentors. I'm really pleased to see you all again. My name is Elham Fardad, as you know, the founder and CEO of the charity Migrant Leaders. Really excited to be delivering this quarterly mentors webinar where we engage with you guys. And every time we have a keynote speaker on a related topic. And this quarter is particularly exciting because we've got Karen Malan here, who is an absolute expert on intercultural communication. And she's going to be talking about and presenting to you on how to get the best out of your teams across cultures and borders. Which is a topic that in many of our companies and roles we would be interested in. By way of a quick introduction on migrant leaders, you will recall that we had our mentors conference this summer, hosted by Anglo American, where we talked about the fact that we had reached 1,000 migrant leaders, mentors from 95 FTSE 100 companies and leading firms. We have big ambitions. We want to grow that to 5,000 migrant leaders, mentors, and 5,000 mentees. We currently have just under 1,200 young mentees between 16 and 25 who typically join us during their A-levels and continue to be on our comprehensive free program until they land their first professional job. So sometimes for 3, 4, 5 years on our program, where they get everything they need in order to turn their education into professional success. And we couldn't do it without your help as migrant leaders, mentors. For us, the experience of mentoring with migrant leaders is really important. As you know, we've spent the last 5 years building a robust program with excellent policies, procedures, processes, and the program that we know really works. But every time someone says to me, migrant leaders is brilliant, I'd like us to up our game a notch. So in a few months or sooner, you'll be hearing from me about our migrant leaders mobile app, which will further enhance and transform the mentoring experience for you, so that instead of one-to-one relationships, you get choices to select your matched mentees, one or more mentees for multiple or single mentoring conversations. So that will really provide you with what many mentors have told us would enjoy and benefit from. So more on that later. Without further ado, I am delighted to introduce you to Karen Malan, who will be telling you a little bit about her career background and her presentation on how to get the best from your cross-border team. Thank you.
Hi, so thank you so much, Elham, for inviting me. It's an absolute privilege to be here, and what a pleasure to meet all these interesting and lovely people. I'm going to see if I can share my screen again. Let's see if this is going to work. And can you see my slides?
We can indeed.
Okay, that's great. So we go into slide view, okay, so before I start, actually just a little bit about me. Sorry, figure out how to move this on. There we go. So I had the privilege, I consider it a privilege, of having grown up with sort of as a third culture kid. My parents were diplomats, and I spent my childhood and my entire childhood actually moving around the world. I've lived, studied, and worked in multiple countries and 3 continents. That includes Africa, Angola, South Africa, Portugal, Finland, the UK, and the USA. And I studied linguistics and then did a PhD in social linguistics. And what that is basically, social linguistics, is it just means how language is used by real people in the real world, as opposed to the abstract study of language. So on a macro level, that means that it's looking at global patterns in language use, language and power, how things work in multicultural, multilingual countries. And on a micro level, it's looking at the close dynamics of interactions between people. So that's sort of my background area, my academic area. And I spent a lot of my career in academic roles teaching and training teachers, educators and clinicians. And from there, when I moved to the UK, it actually was a short jump into the intercultural sphere. And I qualified as an intercultural trainer for business. And I also teach and train international graduate business students in intercultural communication for business and working across cultures. I am based in London. I live in London, work in Leicester, spend quite a lot of time in Belgium, where my Belgian partner lives, and as much time as I can in South Africa, where my mother and good friends and colleagues live. So enough of me. What I want to just cover is why intercultural training, what is its value, what it is and isn't, a brief look at tools and databases that we use, and along the way I hope to just talk a little bit about some key culture and communication issues that divide and challenge teams. So I just thought I'd start out, before I start with the substance, I thought that for a bit of fun and hopefully a bit of interest, I draw your attention to a few behaviours that are fairly typical in the British workplace, that you might take for granted, but which could be seen differently by other people. So does this sound like British speak to you? I see a few nods there. All right, so if we look at the first set of words, perhaps, might, possibly, etc., these are what we call hedges, because they tend to avoid commitment to some extent. They soften the force of a message. They leave a bit of room for doubt. And then the second set, you couldn't possibly, by any chance, would you mind awfully, you might want to think about, I wondered if you might want to make 1 or 2 small changes. These are actually requests. They might actually even be orders, instructions, but they are expressed in such indirect ways so that if you were used to a direct and straightforward way of communicating, this might not sound like an instruction at all. And then we have, so those are indirect requests, and then we have an awful lot of sorries, beloved by the British. So actually what we have going on here is what linguists call face work. And I always find it interesting how often I hear people say, oh, face. Now that's something that's really important in China, isn't it? Or perhaps in Asia. And this is such a misunderstanding, because in fact, face is important in every culture. And it's closely tied to language politeness. That also exists in every culture, but it can be expressed in very different ways across cultures. So face has these 2 complementary sides. On the one side, face is about our desire for appreciation and to be appreciated. And to respect that side of face, we use language to signal deference or approval. So perhaps using titles or the formal vous form, or any language that's explicitly inclusive. The other side of face is our desire not to impose or to be imposed on. And for that, we use language to minimize imposition. And in British culture, we see both these forms of linguistic politeness. But something that's quite distinctive here is that you find a lot of language to minimize imposition. And that often takes the form of those hedges, indirectness, and apologizing. So I just want to show you, this is, you might have seen some version of this on the internet. There's a lot of these going around online. So what the British say, what you think they mean, what they actually mean. Sometimes this is framed as what the Dutch think they mean or what the Germans think they mean, because those are 2 cultures which tend to be very forthright and direct in their communication, unlike the British. So, that's not bad. Could mean that's actually very good. I only have a few minor comments. You're going to need to redo this whole thing, right? Or you must come to dinner. This is not an invitation. I'm just being polite. All right. Now, this is, of course, meant to be a bit of fun. I mean, that's written for humorous effect. We're not meant to take it very seriously. But I think you'd agree that there is some grain of truth here. indirectness in communication, along with understatement and irony. These are very pervasive cultural features of how British people use language. And it's not hard to see how this can be confusing at best to non-native English speakers, certainly. And at worst, it can give rise to a breakdown of trust. So, for example, a Russian interculturalist that I worked with recently told me that at her big tech firm in St. Petersburg, she said people often say to her with feeling, they say, "This is why we can't trust the British. They never say what they mean," right? Now, obviously, that is not the intention at all. On the contrary, as I'm trying to show, quite a lot of this is about linguistic politeness to preserve face by not imposing. But it is easy to see how confusing this can be to someone from a culture that values direct, straightforward communication. So here's another few examples, and I think these are all pretty standard practice in British business. The icebreaker at the beginning of a meeting, the email, how we open it with a personal connection of some kind, and the subject line of the email. Now, I'm actually just going to leave these here for a bit for you to think about. I mean, I'm going to move on, but I'll leave you to think perhaps about these as we go along. And then I want to come back to them later and ask you later whether you think there's anything weird about them from a different cultural perspective. So let's move on then to, what is the value of intercultural training? Well, historically, I think that its value has been quite well perceived for quite some time in the zone of cross-border ventures and partnerships, because we've seen there's some really well-reported clashes of culture or just failure to understand the other culture in some famous failed mergers and acquisitions, foreign market entries, expat assignment, and in some tone-deaf marketing campaigns. But in more recent years, we've seen a big shift in what the needs are for intercultural training, because it's become increasingly the norm to have multinational and multicultural workforces and teams, often virtual teams, in which, I want to add, English may well be the lingua franca, but it is likely not to be the first language of many people. So most organizations these days, I think, are recognizing and even embracing the power of diversity. But as you know, the fact that you have a diverse workforce does not guarantee that everyone is getting along swimmingly and feeling inclusive and included and recognized, and collaboration is going well. On the contrary, we are likely to find conflicting cultural values and approaches, conflicting communication styles, differences either being unappreciated or ignored, leaving colleagues feeling misunderstood and misrepresented. We find ethnocentrism, stereotyping, an understandable resistance to adaptation, and many non-native English speakers, as I've said. Just on that last point about many non-native English speakers, I'm not actually going to say much in this talk about that particular point. So I do just want to say now that to make the point that using a second or even a third or fourth language to communicate in at work is emotionally challenging and cognitively draining for the speakers. And we see very often a level of complacency and unawareness from native English speakers, who are often essentially monolingual, who assume that, well, because we can all speak English, then that's all right then, surely. And very often they are making language choices that directly impact their colleagues' capacity to understand and to collaborate. So I just mentioned that as well here. So I think what we're seeing is that many of these myths that I've mentioned here, successful leadership looks the same, people can easily acquire multicultural skills, there's a universal approach to management. Many of these myths are gradually being exposed. one of the reasons that we know all of this is happening is because we see increasingly surveys conducted globally telling us that managers say that their biggest challenge is managing international teams. And also we see employers across all sectors that are consistently telling universities and business schools that the number one competencies they want to see in graduates are those communication and people engagement skills for working collaboratively with teams of people from a range of backgrounds and countries. So if we look at this, a culturally diverse, what we mean by culturally diverse workplace is just one where interactions are going on between people from all of these kinds of overlapping social groups and probably more groups, all of which impact on our sense of identity and our ways of thinking and behaving. And that these people get on and understand each other and that they feel seen and included is pretty fundamental to an organization's success. So that's very much the focus of a great deal of intercultural training. So I also just want to talk about two common misconceptions what intercultural work is not. So firstly, it's not teaching, it's not primarily teaching people about foreign cultures. That's not to say that you won't learn something about foreign cultures, you probably will. But my point is just to say that the landscape has changed. So 20 years ago, you probably didn't think much about culture unless you were seconded by your company, you were sent on an expat relocation assignment, say to Japan, and then they'd send along an expert on Japanese culture so you could learn the basics. That's how people thought about cross-cultural business. I'm off to work with our new partners in Saudi Arabia. What do I need to know about that culture? But today, it's very different. Today, it is far more likely that you are running a global team without ever leaving your own country. That you are sitting in your bedroom in Sheffield or Johannesburg or Louisville, Kentucky, and you are running a virtual team of people in different parts of the globe. And now you are dealing with a whole raft of culturally based different approaches to how and when and in what way things get done, and also very different ways of communicating ideas and information. So it's no longer about how do I manage one culture and how do they perceive me, but how do all these various cultures on my team perceive one another, and how can I improve that collaboration? It's a far more complex situation of cultural relativity. And it's made even more complicated when we are working and communicating remotely. Virtual teams involve much more subtle, complex interactions. We cannot see people's reactions, and simple things we do can create impressions that we had really not intended. So a lot of intercultural what a lot of interculturalists and social linguists like me are doing is unpicking the impacts of the way that people are working together and communicating with one another, and giving tools for understanding and navigating differences. So to go to that second misconception, intercultural training is not primarily about teaching people business etiquette, things like honorifics, forms of address, how to accept a business card, nor is it primarily about the more superficial aspects of culture like preferences in food or dress or customs. Most of those things you can pick up in a guidebook. To explain this point further, we can use a tree as an analogy for culture. So the leaves are the products, the objects or artifacts like buildings, clothes, food, music, forms of communication like an email or a contract. Those are the products. The branches are the practices, regular and typical behaviors, including ways of communicating. But both of these are manifesting what's below the surface of the ground, the underlying values, perspectives, and norms of a social group. And these are hidden below the surface. They are deep-seated values and beliefs that are not visible, and many of which we are often not fully conscious of ourselves. So if we think of, for example, of an email as a product, well, sure, it's helpful for people to know the email etiquette that is expected in your organization, but perhaps a lot more helpful when we can give people the knowledge to understand why those emails from such and such a person are so annoying or obtuse or just downright confusing, because now they have a better understanding of the values and the perspectives that underlie those email practices. So instead of getting irritated and frustrated, I now have the possibility of modifying my own response in a more adaptive way. So where we as interculturalists are working is really down at that level. We're developing awareness of how these different values and perspectives are showing up in workplace behaviors and practices. So I'll give some concrete examples of that. These are some of the values and perspectives, those below the ground things that we know are particularly sensitive to and variable across cultures. And we know that they impact directly on workplace practices. So what's our attitude to hierarchy and status? Do we both expect and respect a hierarchy of status differences, that decisions are going to come from the top down and we'll just get on with it? Or are we used to and we expect a more egalitarian work culture where we try to minimize hierarchical differences? We will expect to be consulted in decisions. We will expect to be able to question and disagree freely with our superiors. This is, obviously very typical in countries like the UK, the US, the Netherlands, and many other countries. So this impacts hugely on a big range of workplace practices, expectations, and perceptions. This is what Geert Hofstede, who you may have heard of, calls power distance, right? And how people react to that. A second is the individual more important or the group? Well, we saw that one play out quite interestingly around the world during the pandemic, I think. But a team can often be struggling around this issue. So you've got team members who are acting individually. They're saying, right, what do I do first? How do I get recognized for my contribution? What do I need to go off and do my bit? And that can be about different cultural preferences. They were brought up in a culture where individualism is key. But you've got others thinking, hang on, we've got to discuss this as a team, work out what our group objectives are, and so on. So most teams, of course, prosper with a combination of both those approaches, but you could be looking at somebody's reaction and saying, well, they're wrong and I'm right. So it's about understanding our own preferences and saying, let's sit together and work out how we're going to make this team function. A third one that is hugely divisive in teams is how do we build trust with the people we work with? So let's say I'm working with you guys and I'm over on the task-focused end of the continuum. It's not going to be very important to me to get to know you as people. My trust is going to be based on confidence in our joint performance on the task that we're busy with. And that is cognitive trust. And you find this a lot in countries like the UK, the US, and so on. I'm also, if I'm over on that end of the continuum, I'm likely to place great store on the written word, and I want written contracts. So when we have meetings, at the end of that meeting, I'm going to want to see that someone is writing up exactly what was said, what was discussed, what was agreed, and those are going to go around and make sure that everybody is in full agreement with that. But if I'm over on that relationship-focused end of the continuum, then my personal relationships with you are going to be the priority. So trust for me will come primarily from the personal relationships that I've built with you. And that's effective trust, which we find in countries that have highly relationship-focused cultures, like China, Nigeria, India, Brazil, the UAE, also France, Belgium, and Spain, for example, relative to the UK. And if this is where I am, then I'm probably going to find a verbal agreement could be quite adequate for me. And actually, if you want to, come to me after the meeting and say, where I've offered something and say, well, can we just, make sure we get this written in writing and a guarantee from you, that could actually be quite offensive and insulting to me because, you're questioning my word, you're questioning my integrity. Okay. Others include how strong is our need for certainty? How comfortable are we with risk? So if I'm strongly uncertainty avoidant, I'm going to want a lot of structure and rules. I want to spend a lot of time planning for every potential pitfall in a project. I would be a typical German in that case. But if I'm at the other end of the continuum, then I'm okay with ambiguity. I'm comfortable and flexible enough to deal ad hoc with problems as they arise. How do we feel about rules? Am I on the side of what Trompenaars calls universalist? I believe there must be one rule for all, no exceptions. Or am I more particularist? I feel that rules can be sensibly, pragmatically adjusted to fit particular circumstances or relationships. And what's my approach to time? Am I from a linear time culture, focus on one thing at a time, take deadlines and schedules very seriously, or a more flexible time culture where I can comfortably do many things at once and time commitments and schedules are to be achieved if possible? Okay, so these are all fairly fundamental differences that impact significantly on our behaviors and our practices and our ability to work together. So what intercultural work is then is a process that looks a bit like this. Self-awareness is absolutely key. When we understand our own individual set of cultural preferences and orientations, our own communication styles, that's an essential step. And this is something that organizations very often forget about, that individual who walks in the door brings with them a cultural profile, a set of values, preferences, orientations to the way they're going to do things. Some of which will be personal or personality linked, but many of which have been shaped by the cultures we've grown up in, from our family to our schooling, to communities, to the organizations we've worked in that have shaped our reactions. And most of which that individual is maybe pretty unconscious about. It's just the way you do things. Okay, and when we combine that development of self-awareness with a sharing of global knowledge, in which we're learning to understand others, the orientations of the people we're working with, this is what I would call a global mindset and cultural intelligence, then we're able to build effective, positive, and collaborative teams. I want to very briefly talk about some of the tools and databases that we have at our disposal, because actually we have an enormous amount of global research data. So I'm going to just mention 3 databases that are widely used in business to capture cultural values. I'm sure that many of you have heard of Geert Hofstede, the Dutch social psychologist. He has a massive database from multiple countries. His intercultural profiler, he calls it the culture in the workplace questionnaire. That's what the country data is based on, but we can use it as a personal tool to look at our own individual orientations on his 6 scales. And then Fons Trompenaars, also Dutch, who has a similarly huge database from multiple countries. And again, he's got the personal diagnostic tool and which you can plot yourself. I've just shown you here some examples of 2 countries that have been plotted with the data from those countries on his 7 dimensions. And then a third is that of Erin Meyer, who's at INSEAD in Paris. And she has a similar set of tools to offer, again, some really useful additional dimensions. She focuses a lot more, additionally on communication, the way we communicate in verbally and in writing, the way we give feedback on performance, how we deal with disagreement. So just to show you an example here, this is my personal cultural profile, on my results on Erin Meyer's tool. And so it's showing you where I as an individual, the blue circle is where I as an individual lie on these scales. And I decided to enter, the red triangle is the data from the UK, but you could put in any country you like to compare. So just to show you, for example, let's just look here. This is showing that when I present information, I tend to have a preference for the approach, the deductive principles first approach that is much more common in France and Germany, as opposed to an applications approach, first approach, which is more common here in Britain. So that means that, depending on who my audience is, I might want to think about, changing my approach to that. If you look down at the bottom left here, This is showing that I'm relatively comfortable with an environment in which disagreement can be expressed openly. But if you look up here, top right, you'll see that when I give feedback, as in a performance review, I really like to give negative feedback indirectly, sandwiched with lots of positive feedback. And now that's going to work for some people very well, but for other people, that's going to actually be unhelpful and confusing. You can also see down here, bottom right, that I'm well over on the relationship-focused end of the continuum. And in that way, I'm very different from the average British person in the workplace. So we do need to be a little wary of data that is based on national values. As you know, very many nations in the world are highly multicultural. So, you could ask the question, whose culture is being reflected in the data? And also, increasingly, very many individuals are bicultural or cultural hybrids. That's people like me. As I described to you, you too, Elham, I'm sure you would describe yourself as a cultural hybrid, and perhaps many others of you. And we have many young people in the world, in our super diverse cities, who are migrants themselves or have a family history of migration and don't identify neatly with one particular national culture. They're forging new, more complex cultural identities. So culture is not static or fixed as could be suggested by these databases. What I think the real value of these tools is that they give us a means to explore our own cultural orientations and those of the people we work with. So if you just go back for a second to this, I've compared myself to British data, but I think you can see the value that if we had everyone else on the team, other individuals in my team represented here, we'd get a really, really interesting basis for comparison of our different strengths and weaknesses and where our preferences lie. So this is the real value of tools like this. So when we compare each individual members of a team, we can start exploring our interactions as a team. We can understand how our actions create perceptions in others, so we now have the means to adapt our behaviors when it's likely to increase our effectiveness. And we can start to leverage diversity because we're able to recognize the value of different perspectives and approaches. Okay. So yeah, and I think that this point about giving a language, that a major benefit of intercultural training for teams is that it gives people who lead and participate in teams a language for dealing with the problems, the challenges, and the frustrations of working with people with very different orientations and approaches. So instead of I'm right, you're wrong, what's wrong with you? You need to learn to do things my way. We have I see we're coming at this with some quite different perspectives on the same thing. Now we've got a language to talk about what's going on here and decide consciously how we deal with the situation. Okay, so we could start to see the added value of exploiting and using differences in approach instead of seeing the difference as a problem. Okay, I think that I'm very rapidly running out of time, but I would just want to finish, I would be interested in some of your thoughts on these, and perhaps we could just, if there's time, just very briefly discuss these. Do you have any thoughts about these phenomena? Yeah.
If you can put your hand up if you have any thoughts or questions, but my immediate observation, Karen, is I personally always found it odd that someone is trying to ask you how you are, but does it with a closed end question or a closed end sentence, like I hope this email finds you well, which doesn't enable me to really tell them how I really am. And after 35 years in the UK, I still struggle with that. I've just learned to say I'm very well, thank you, regardless of what the real answer is.
Yes. I see there's someone else with a hand up.
Brahma, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that one, I go with Ellen. I think that's always the one that is unusual for me. I hope this email finds you well. And I wrote about, I'm good, how are you? And then it's a pause because they don't realize that response. I respond back with that. So I think they don't want a conversation. It's more of a statement. And it's interesting that and I didn't realize it was a quirk in the system, because I always find that really unusual. I don't know if they wanted to respond back, so I always respond back with, I said, I'm good or I'm not good. I've had a bad day. I even wrote, I've had a bad day.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think that then they get shocked by it. They go, oh. And the email kind of puts them off. So yeah, I think we say it in more, I don't want to say lip service. It's more of a lip service rather than reaction. It's like, how are you? And people say, I'm good. And that's it. You move on. You're already moving on to the next statement without realizing that you've got to listen to them. So.
Exactly. Well, actually, what
I hadn't realized it was a quirk.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think Brahma said it's a bit of a
nothing.
It's a bit of a quirk. Clearly, I noticed that Lucia has joined in, and Lucia, I know that you come from a similar country to my husband, so maybe you have some observations about how different cultures communicate and how that can cause some interesting challenges.
Hi there. Sorry, I'm run late on calls. I'm glad you're recording this. I was really looking forward to it. Yeah, so communication across cultures, that is a big one. Because then I think the most common thing is when people are inappropriate without really meaning to. Because there is a way you express yourself, especially, I'm Italian. We are quite colorful when we talk. And sometimes you just have to be really, really mindful of even your tone of voice. So maybe a word that in another language exists, but it means something completely different. And it is a very bad meaning. So that's created quite a bit of challenges, really trying to think about who you're talking to, taking that time to mindfully craft what you're going to say. Yeah, and always I think if you see, I pay attention to body language a lot, because I know that sometimes that's a very good indicator whether I've crossed any line. And just making sure that I'm actually not doing any collateral damage. But it's an interesting one.
I totally get that. And I wonder if, Karen, I may pose a question that we could discuss. When you were looking at the different spectrums and power distance, status, individualism versus team-oriented, all these factors where different cultures on average fall in different places in the spectrum, it made me realize no wonder that often those of us who are different to the group have difficulty getting hired, getting developed and progressing in certain organizations or teams. On the one hand, I think we should all be aware of these factors, and regardless of where we each sit naturally in those spectrums, we should try and flex our style so that we work well together. But to what extent do you think individuals should try and fit in with the group that they've entered?
Well, I think you see that is exactly the crux of the matter, because when you feel that your difference in approach is something that you should keep quiet about or play down and to try to conform, then actually the team is losing out on a potential strength, because those differences can be real strengths in certain situations. So I think that is really the value of being able to explore and expose and say, well, this is where we all, and to understand that there's never a right or a wrong. There are only strengths in different areas that can be leveraged for the benefit of the team. So I think that's the thing. And I just to the very last thing I want to say is just to actually point out that all of these examples I've given you here are in fact examples of, I just have to move on the slide. They're all examples of task-based cultural approaches. So you're seeing here, this is just sort of a rough indication of where countries lie. But you can see that the UK is quite well over on the task-focused end, and these are classic task-based behaviors. So so for example, when we think about the the idea of an icebreaker at the beginning of a meeting, well, in Britain, that's the sort of classic nod to relationship building, that you've got 5 minutes at the beginning of a meeting for introductions, which is called, quite bizarrely, if you're from a relationship-oriented culture, an icebreaker, because it's like, well, what ice is there to break here, right? And, you know, where, hi, I'm John and I'm head of accounting, is seen as quite enough of the personal stuff, perhaps even more, for some people more than they want to know about John. And you then go, right, phew, we've done the personal disclosure, let's get down to the agenda. So if you are from a relationship-based culture, that's going to seem woefully inadequate. In those kinds of cultures, you know, 50 to 80% of a meeting can be focused on meaningful personal connections. If you know, you know. If you've experienced this, you know what I mean.
Thank you so much, Karen. I see Portia, you've got your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I always find icebreakers really awkward. And I'm born and brought up in England, so I kind of am really embedded in I consider myself to be embedded in English culture, although my heritage is Indian Pakistani. But am I the only one? They just seem so awkward, and I find myself often having to sit in and trying to think of something really interesting to say about myself, and it's just, you know, so awkward.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, Portia.
There are loads of hands up. What do other people think?
Yes. So, John, I see your hands are up.
Yeah, thanks. I used to feel very much the same about the icebreakers. I used to think that they were a platitude, the kind of, hey, everybody, I'm a nice person. That's the start of the call. Everybody else does the same. Until somebody, a Russian colleague of mine, pointed out that when your native language is quite so substantially different to the main language that's being spoken in the meeting, the brief bit of communication at the start of the meeting, which doesn't necessarily hold any business weight, is really helpful for orientating who is speaking and their voice and the tone, and especially on Zoom calls, because then you can associate the voice with the face, and it's really important just to get used to the tone of people's voice speaking in a language which may not be your own. So it almost doesn't matter in that situation exactly what's being said. It's just a, hey, here's a verbal communication from me as a human being. And that was mind-blowing for me when I heard that the first time. So just thought I'd share.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, John. And I guess it's the listener's opportunity to show with their body language and face that I'm about to listen to you and I actually want to listen to you. So it starts the meeting off on a very good note. Glenn, I see that your hand is up.
Yes, just on a wider thing, my background is the NHS, and you know that something like 2 in 5 of our junior doctors didn't train in this country. And we see these real cultural difficulties when you take people who come straight into not only the medical culture, but the different cultures we have in where behavior, approach to hierarchy and so forth, such as it becomes an increasing problem. And that often leads to complaints, really, that center around communication. And then people perceive they haven't been adequately trained. And really, it's a clash of cultures and ways of communicating that are the real issue here. And this has come to the point now where when we have an induction program for junior doctors, not only do we talk about our policies and procedures of what you might do in our hospital, and this is how we practice medicine, it's also how we interact with each other and lessons from people who have come to the hospitals that they can give to people who are just newly arriving, saying, this is weird, the British do this way, but this is the way they do it, and they don't mean anything by it. And that's been quite helpful in trying to reduce some of the communication problems that we've seen.
It's interesting, Glenn. I reflect back to my time in EY, for example. I came to the UK from Iran, a rather hierarchical culture, status-driven, and a lot of what Karen said really resonates. And I came to the UK at the age of 13, and you would think after 20, 30 years, some of these things change. But I've learned to kind of flex myself and adapt my style, because even in EY, as recently as a few years ago, and I was a senior manager, so it was perfectly legitimate for me to spend time with partners and senior partners. But I noticed that I would always approach their secretary, their EA, to make an appointment to have a chat with a partner, because I have such respect for hierarchy and a status. I noticed many junior staff would just pop by the partner's desk and get onto projects and get opportunities. And as a more senior person, I was missing out on opportunities because of my own kind of lack of adaptability in that area. So I had to really challenge myself and say, look, it's perfectly legitimate behavior in this place to go and talk to a partner at his desk if he looks like he has capacity and time to say hello and what's up next and can I be on this project. So we really, I think each of us have to continue to challenge ourselves and keep adapting and adapting every day.
Could I ask a question of Glenn, just on that issue of junior doctors that come from different countries and have training from overseas? When, as you were speaking, I was thinking that the complaints were coming from patients. Is that the case, or is it between colleagues?
It's both. It's because the communication is so widespread, but it certainly comes in-house. We, for example, we always use first names, and that can be uncomfortable for people from a very hierarchical society, and they don't expect somebody to speak to them by their first names and to use their title. And that causes a bit of grind, and it's examples like that that go right with patients and also, but with their co-workers particularly.
That's interesting. So we've got Ashwin, you've got your hand up as well.
Hi everyone. The Erin Myers tool, that is really, it was really interesting to hear about that. And in the current company that I'm working in, we are in the midst of doing a global project, which requires a level of buy-in from individuals and workforce across the world. So we've got several key geographies like Australia, Saudi Arabia, UK, Malaysia, and it's a technology project. However, it touches people in the sense that it's all about the employee experience. So when it comes to the actual delivery of the projects, at the very early stages, we're starting to see some of those cultural differences starting to crop up, i.e. the message that's been taken away, because the central team sits in the UK, the project terminology and how we execute the project and how we think about the project is very different to, for instance, in Saudi Arabia. So, and even when we do voice of the customer sessions, we realize that some of our Saudi colleagues are quite quiet in the call, whereas the UK colleagues are very chatty. They are not shy in expressing their opinion, or in some instances displeasure at some of the solutions which are being suggested, whereas in KSA our Saudi colleagues tend to really not necessarily speak up. All the solutions are good solutions, everything's fine, and we realized most of these calls are done via WebEx or Skype as opposed to being in country. But when you travel to the country and you sit down with them and then you have an intimate sort of conversation with them over a cup of coffee, you start to hear more about the project and their real thought process, because they feel more safer in sharing that. So this tool is something really useful, Karen. I think I'm going to suggest this back to my team to try and run this, to understand how we message to our global colleagues, because it's a huge change project and we need to understand the nuances of cultures to effectively implement it globally. So no, thank you so much for that.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. And you've touched on so many kind of important points there. I would just say, and we think about different forms of communication, and email is the most task-based kind of communication, right? And the most relationship-based is face-to-face we are present with each other in the same room, and we have a whole lot in between. And you would think that possibly, you know, video conferencing, well, you can, most of the time you can see people, but it is not a substitute for actual face-to-face conversation for people from strongly relationship-based cultures, as the Saudis, for example. Yeah,
I think one of the challenges, Karen, is that cultures such as Japanese and certain Eastern cultures, it's not considered good to criticize or even give feedback to a more senior individual in front of their colleagues. So where you're getting a group of people together to consult on a particular business solution, many might have contributions, really valuable contributions to make in their feedback, but they would be reluctant to give feedback regarding the boss or a senior colleague, in case he or she loses faith in their minds.
absolutely.
So how do we get those colleagues to contribute when they're conscious of that power distance?
Yeah, well, that's a thing that you've got to find alternative ways of giving opportunities to people like that to express their opinions, perhaps with a one-to-one meeting or in a small group meeting. So yeah, we absolutely have to look at that. You know, the idea that, you know, oh, we're all connected in a great big happy Zoom call, it just doesn't work for so many people from so many cultures. So we've got to find alternative modes of communication.
That's good to know. And I think John and Lucia, you both still have your hand up. I wonder if one of you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this because this is a very, this conversation is very close to home for me on many levels. As a student, not so long ago, I lived in China for nearly 2 years. And that was, you know, coming from Italy and going to this complete different culture was an interesting exercise for me, you know, really trying to understand how do I relate and how do I connect. When and then I moved into the workplace, I do think that the approach has improved and there is a better understanding of the need to address these cultural differences. But culture is a very big term. You know, you might have people that are demographically linked to a country, but they culturally, they feel they belong to something else, which could be the country they've migrated to, or maybe they've got biracial parents and they choose one culture over the other they feel more in tune with. So I think, you know, for me, the priority at business level should really be around cultural agility. I really agree with what we just said now, is really to create those outlets and those environments, those safe environments where people can communicate their expectations. But there is also a responsibility from the business to really give people tools to work better with each other and understand, you know, building some bridges, because sometimes it's very difficult, especially when you have some sort of hierarchical difference in a team, for somebody to just come forward and say, I really think that we need to address how we communicate with each other, because you might feel intimidated, you might feel it's not your place to say that. And sometimes, you know, I've seen companies that they think that the only people that need training is managers. But sometimes no, you also need it through the other ranks of the business. Virtual teams, you end up working with people on projects and you need to set expectations, you need to create an harmony in that team. And you, although, you know, it's a bit difficult to do, but I think you'd also need to try and take your emotional self a little bit out of the equation, really trying to think, okay, guys, we are in this together. How do we make it work? But you need tools for that. You need communication. You need somebody that kind of gives you that head start and you build on it. So it takes a while. I've seen changes, positive changes around businesses where I'm lucky enough to work with. And it's definitely become something that everybody's more aware of. But I think there is still quite a bit of work to do.
Absolutely, and I really, and that your word agility is absolutely spot on, because we're never going to be asking someone to change their own authentic style of interacting and doing things, but what we are giving them is a language and a mindset to have that ability to be flexible. So it's but like sort of having you've got the one foot planted firmly on the ground, that's you, that's your authentic self, but with your other foot you are able to make adjustments where it's going to be effective, where it's going to be helpful, and you've got that flexibility to switch cultural frames. And I think also you talked about people who do come from, like yourself, who do have sort of different, sort of like a mixed cultural identity. Cultural hybrids are actually really, really good at this, because they've learned to navigate different worlds. Elham has learned to navigate a range of different cultural frames of reference. So and that is what you want to teach other people, basically.
I remember, Karen, early in my career when I was in GE in my 20s, in my second role in GE, I was responsible for financial operations across Europe in part of GE Energy. And on a particular visit to see my Madrid team, I had only barely 2 days with that team and a ton of things to go through and tasks to do. And being a naturally results-driven, task-oriented person, brought up by the British and Americans, the fact that the Spanish team very kindly wanted to take 3 hours to take me out for lunch and break the GE rules and have wine during that lunch. I remember how I felt. And now looking back, I realized I should have thought about what their intentions are. Their intentions wasn't to break the rules. Their intention wasn't to waste time and not do the work. They were building a relationship, of course. So these days, I remind myself, what is this person's intention? And often it's good intentions, actually. People generally mean well. So if we remind them of their intentions, our cultural differences are much easier to adapt towards.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you think about just to go back to that this spread, but this is actually from Erin Meyer. I think if you live and work in the UK and you get quite used to this sort of very task-focused culture, it's easy to forget that, great swathes of the world are relationship-oriented. Quite a lot of European countries. You've got France, Italy, Spain there, but virtually the whole of South America, the Middle East, most of Asia, East and South Asia, are much more strongly relationship focused. So it really is as well to remember this and to know that this is why a lot of our practices can really not go down well and be perceived as quite strange.
That's very interesting. We have just about come to an end of our mentors webinar. Karen, it has been an absolute pleasure and really insightful. If anyone has any final comments, you're welcome to ask any questions or final comments. But other than that, we're happy to close and thank Karen for her incredibly insightful presentation.
Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
I would just like to say, just on behalf of the mentees, just to remind mentors that a lot of our mentees are dealing with that cross-cultural thing. And I often have a conversation with them about, being Indian or Pakistani in the home and then having to be English at school and outside. And that was me back in the 80s, 70s and 80s. And that is the same conversation I have with the young people that I speak to these days. So, nothing very much changes.
Thank you, Fawzia. That really resonates with me as well. Rahma, you have your hand up.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Fawzia. I think that's most South Asians have that. It's their second when they come here, they are Asians at home, and then it's British outside, and that cultural divide has thing. The one thing that interesting me is that I hadn't realised some of the things that relationship-based and task-based culturally. So some teams have been global for me, and I've never really understood why we don't always work and you try to adapt, etc. So I had a team in India, we had a problem and they expect me to come up with a solution. And I don't come up with a solution. I expect people to come into it. So we sat there for about half an hour of the meeting, no one said anything. And they just kept looking at me for the answer, which is very cultural, you know what I mean? It's a sort of, and I said, well, I don't know the answer to all the questions. They looked at me puzzledly. How can you be the leader if you don't know the answer to the solution? I said, I don't. That's not, I'm sure you guys have a solution. And then over time, which took probably about six months, 12 months, they got used to me, not always having the answer to the solution, but making sure that we do the right thing as a team collectively. And then build bridges. I went over there to build bridges and, you know, spend time with them to get to know them individually. And they're much more comfortable. And then when I left, they got someone from India and they hated it because I went back to the old culture that they didn't. So sometimes you bed in that culture, they like it or don't like it. And if it does go back to the old culture, some of them don't like it. So it's quite interesting that you can be careful about, you know, developing people. And when you leave, the next person's a different culture and people have to relearn again. So it's important that.
Thank you. That was really, really insightful. And I totally recognize those patterns.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So we end with cultural adaptability, Karen. Thank you so much, everyone. And we wish you a very happy weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
Are you going to share the
Bye,
slides?
everyone.
Are you going to share the slides, Ellen?
We will be sharing the presentation because it's recorded. The video will be shared in a couple of weeks' time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Karen.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you all. And thank you, Alan.